Okay, good morning, everyone. Boker Tov, good Shabbos. How's everybody? It's beautiful this morning. Those of you who came last week, thank you for your patience. On behalf of the Department of Water and Power, I offer you my apologies. It wasn't our fault.
Who cut the line?
DWP. The whole neighborhood was out.
Who cut it?
I don't know, 600 customers. Anyway, those of you who were with us last week, thank you for being patient. I really appreciate it. And those online who were listening, I'm sorry about last week. We had a power failure. The whole neighborhood was down. But we did Torah study in the dark, as only Jews can do. So, yeah, thank you. Because you couldn't read the text. You had to accept what I told you it said. Good morning. So, wonderful being together. This morning, following our learning together, there's a service in the Sher Lopati. There's 2 kids being named. The grandchildren of the Warner family are being named, which is great. Great-grandchildren, yeah. The Dubie's great-grandchildren and Mike and Sherry. Anyway, they're lovely kids, lovely families. And that's it, just davening this morning. It's kind of nice. Tonight begins the holiday of Shavuot. More Torah discussion today, right. And the blintzes, I think, for dessert. Tonight begins the holiday Shavuot, which we'll talk about in a moment in terms of substance. But the tradition on Shavuot is to stay up all night studying. We're not that hardy. But we will begin at 7:30 with a Tikkun Leil Shavuos. The topic, we're going to look very carefully at the book of Ruth, which is the Megillah, the book that is traditionally studied for the holiday of Shavuot. And we'll look at it through some of the lenses of issues that are very contemporary, of insiders and outsiders, of identity, and of, come in, power and powerlessness. And then tonight, in addition to the study of the book, Cantor Barron and a group of wonderful singers have prepared selections from a cantata that was written by Ami Aloni, our composer of many years. This was Ami's last piece before he passed away. He wrote a beautiful musical setting of the book of Ruth. And they're going to present this tonight in a dramatic fashion. So we'll get to learn the book, and then we'll get to enjoy it, to really feel. In addition, there'll be blintzes, which is a tradition. God brought those down Moses brought those down on Mount Sinai, of course. Not these blintzes, but the idea of blintzes, right? And then following that, Rabbi Farkas will be leading late night. And there's a late night study that goes to about midnight for those who'd like to really stay up and be hardy. So please join us tonight at 7:30. We'll start in the front, and we'll gather and share Lapati. Tomorrow, first day of Shavuot, services will be held in the new Levine Community Center, which is now open. And as part of the service tomorrow, we will dedicate that building. First new building on this campus in 30 years. And it's wonderful because it has that new shul smell. You know, it just smells. It's like when you drive it off the lot and the odometer says 1. You know, I have the shul that has no mileage on it. It's just great. Now it's a beautiful building. It's a beautiful center, gym, library, theater, rooms for learning. And there's an Aron Kodesh, there's an ark in the main room where we'll use for services. And we will put the Torahs in that ark for the first time and recite prayers to dedicate that wonderful place. So, and then there'll be a wonderful lunch, big lunch served, pizza and all kinds of things. And then we have a whole afternoon of activities to show everyone what the building's going to be used for. So there'll be a basketball game, Israeli dance, storytelling, a bounce house, bubbles, all kinds of stuff. So please come, bring kids. The service starts at 9:30. The dedication will take place about 11. And then the activities start about noon. So please come and join us. It's a celebration of the community's accomplishment of erecting a new building and sharing the life of the community. It's a real investment in the future of the community. And then on the second day, on Monday, we'll be back in Sher Lapati for prayers. And that morning, we're going to celebrate members of our circle, of our community, who have found Judaism as adults. And Kelly's going to give us a few words, right? And our good friend Jonathan Hodson, Rabbi Jonathan Hodson, will be sharing a few words. Just to give it, because this is the holiday of Torah, we want to talk to those who have found Torah. It's a beautiful opportunity. And then at the end of that service, Yizkor will be recited. So that's Monday at about 9:30, okay? So tonight, Tikkun Leil Shavuos. Tomorrow, the dedication of the building and davening and activities and pizza. And on Monday, friends who will be discussing their journey to Torah and Yizkor prayers. That's the week. Then everybody graduates. There's all kinds of graduations in the building. One last announcement. So our schedule for Torah study this year, because my vacation schedule is a little bit erratic, I want to make sure that you go. So we'll go 2 more weeks till the 22nd, and the 22nd of June will be our last session for the season, and then we're going to take a hiatus, a vacation, and we will gather again on August 31st, 30th, 31st? The last Shabbos in August. I think it's the 31st. On August 31st. It's the Shabbos of Labor Day weekend. Okay? So the rest of the summer, I'm going to be here during July, and I'll be leading services in the middle weeks of July, and we'll do Torah study as part of the service, but we won't be in here. Okay? So if you'd like to come and learn with us. But this Torah study will take a break until the end of August. And then when I get back from my travels and summer activities, we'll gather again the end of August and continue our learning together. I'll put that on a piece of paper so everybody remembers it. Okay? So far, so good? Good. Not this year. This year going elsewhere in the world. But it's our 40th anniversary, so she's put up with me for 40 years. You know, it's like going through the desert, you know, now she's free. So we're going to celebrate our anniversary in a nice way. A couple of places. Places. Yeah, I don't want anybody here to know. So. Rabbi, I have to talk to you. Nope. There will be a rabbi and a cantor on duty every day of the summer, but it may not be Feinstein, so you'll know that. Okay. Someone's phone is. I hear the Lord God speaking to us. Tonight is the holiday of Shavuot. The holiday of Shavuot is 49 days after Pesach. It's the holiday in which we celebrate the giving or the receiving of Torah on Mount Sinai. The completion of this covenant. The covenant begins with the liberation from Egypt, which is freedom from oppression. And the covenant concludes with the giving of Torah, which is the sealing of a covenant, of a collective common vision of a life of holiness. And we celebrate the giving of Torah on Mount Sinai. The question is, what does that mean, the giving of Torah on Mount Sinai? Even the tradition wasn't quite sure. So you find in the, come in, plenty of room. You find in the tradition a number of interpretations of what this means. The maximalist interpretation, which is found in the pages of the Talmud and the Midrash, is that on Mount Sinai, God revealed to Moshe the entire Torah shebichtav and the entire Torah sheba'al peh, the entire written Torah and the entire oral Torah. Meaning all the words of the Bible Moses got from God on Mount Sinai, all the words of the Bible are God's words, and all the words of the rabbis of the Talmudic tradition were given to Moses on Mount Sinai. And then some clever rabbi asked the question, but Torah sheba'al peh, the oral Torah, is not finished yet. We're still arguing. And the answer is that even a question which a student is yet to answer, ask his teacher, that was given to Moses on Mount Sinai as well. The entire corpus of the... Hey, good morning, guys. Welcome. Hey, Benji. Welcome home. The entire corpus... Morning, Vlad. The entire corpus of the entire tradition, all of it is God's word, and all of it is authoritative. So you can understand that this opinion is the foundational notion of orthodoxy. Because if I say that every word is God's word, you best not mess with it. You best be very careful in how you interpret it. Then there is an alternative tradition in the Midrash, which is that God gave the written Torah, that is the 5 books of Moses. The prophets spoke the words of their prophecies from God. The books of the writings, the Ketubim, were inspired by God, written by holy people, but not directly the words of God. And the Talmudic tradition, while it is authoritative, is not the same as the written tradition. So in Talmud, you have a distinction between midoraita, stuff that's biblical, and midorabanan, stuff that's rabbinic. That's a second way of reading the question from within the tradition itself. Then you have a third way within the tradition itself, which says God gave the 10 Commandments. God spoke the 10 Commandments to the people of Israel. We gathered at Mount Sinai. God came down on the mountain, whatever that means, and spoke the 10 Commandments. We heard the 10 Commandments. They are God's words. Everything else is interpretation. Once you have the principles of the system, you don't need all the details. You could have figured those out on your own. So all the rest of Jewish faith is an interpretation, an extrapolation, an application of the fundamental principles contained in the 10 Commandments. This, by the way, became the dominant interpretation of the Christian community. So for a long time, it was accustomed to recite the 10 Commandments as part of Shema Yisrael. When we say Shema, we have these paragraphs that follow it, including the V'ahavta and then Vayam Shema. It was customary to say the 10 Commandments in there. But because the Christians said that's the only revelation, the rabbi said, no, not true. They took that out. And that's why we don't say the 10 Commandments as part of the Shema anymore. Then there was another idea, which now we get later into history among the philosophers. And one of the philosophers offers this idea. God met the people of Israel at Mount Sinai and spoke the first commandment. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You'll have no other gods before me. That's it. That's all you needed. Because everything else in Jewish faith is an application of that fundamental idea. And you could figure out everything else. If you understand that idolatry is the quintessential sin, and that loyalty to God is the quintessential wisdom, then everything else you could figure out on your own. So that's another idea. Then the most radical idea comes in the Hasidic tradition from the Rishner. And the Rishner Rebbe says the following. When God came down on Mount Sinai, God spoke the first letter of the first word of the 10 Commandments, which sounds innocuous, except you know that the first word of the 10 Commandments is Anochi, I. And the first letter of Anochi is an Aleph. And what's the sound of an Aleph? Well, it's... Now, think so. What is the Rishner saying? This is really important. The Rishner is saying, revelation has no content. Revelation is simply the presence of God. It's the presence of God. That's all you needed, is the presence of God. Knowing that God is there in the world, you could figure out the rest of the tradition on your own. It's a very interesting idea. This is all within the bounds of tradition. This is within the bounds of tradition. Now, when we jump from tradition to modernity, that's us, you're jumping over a huge abyss, a cavern. Because modernity introduces whole new ways of thinking. Mordecai Kaplan, in his wonderful book, The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion, begins with a very powerful observation. We live in a different world than our ancestors did. And you can't underestimate how different our world is from the world of our ancestors. We live in a world of scientific skepticism. We live in a world of cognitive pluralism. We live in a world of, we have neighbors who are of other faiths. We have tools of ancient history and critical text study. We live in a completely different social, political, and cognitive and intellectual world than our ancestors lived in. And when we open up the books that our ancestors read, they read them with great faith. We can't help but bringing the tools of our modernity with us when we open up their books. Because like Maimonides, we want a faith we can really believe in. Now, that said, by the way, there are many of our brothers and sisters who will say, yes, I abide by the laws of cognitive skepticism and scientific empiricism when I'm in the world, but when I come to shul, I become traditional. I simply compartmentalize my life, right? When I go to my doctor, I want to make sure that that doctor's trained in modern medical science, and modern medical science is rooted in the theory of evolution. Evolution is a paradigm. It is a driving intellectual construct that forms the foundation of all modern science, biological science, and all modern medicine. And when I'm sick, I want my doctor to know every damn detail of that. But when I go to shul, I want to believe that God created the world in 6 days. All right, there are people who can do this. Me, I can't, which is why I sound a little skeptical and maybe a little bit less respectful of that position than I should be. And I acknowledge that. Because me, I can't, like Maimonides, I can't live in two intellectual worlds. I'm sorry. But there are many of my brothers and sisters who get up Shabbos morning and go elsewhere. They don't come here, they go elsewhere because they want to live in that pre-modern intellectual world. And I get that. Listen, there are advantages to that too. There are advantages to that too. I can't do that. I don't, many of us can. So what happens if I want to live my modernity, but I also want to understand the tradition that's been handed to me? It's not easy. I mean, what does it do to your reading of the book of Genesis to know that every Near Eastern mythology has a flood story? And in every one of those flood stories, the hero discovers that the land is dried out by sending a raven and a dove. Does that shake you a little bit? What is it when it tells you, when Abraham's servant goes to Mesopotamia to find a wife for Isaac, he brings camels. But we know there were no camels in that part of the world for many centuries. There were no walls around Jericho when the book of Joshua was written. I mean, there are contradictions within the text, and there are contradictions with what we know about the material facts of the history. But then the biggest problem is what we'll call today the problem of Shavuos, which is very simply this. If a guy stands on the corner of Ventura and Sepulveda and screams at the top of his lungs that the Lord God has spoken to him, and this is what he said, we don't run to him and say, teach us, prophet. We call 911. They very gently load him in the back of an ambulance, take him to Olive View, where they give him a shot of Haldol, and he'll feel better. If you've ever been in Jerusalem, the insane asylums of Jerusalem, the mental hospitals of Jerusalem, are filled with lots and lots of people who will tell you with a completely straight face they are Jesus Christ. And they believe it. Now, if a guy today says, I talked to God, and we call him nuts, what are you celebrating on Shavuos? I mean, so it was different a long time ago? It wasn't? When did it stop being insanity and start being prophecy? That's what I want to know. You see, that's the science, that's the difference between our mindset and their mindset. That's the difference. And the fact that you laughed when I told you that means you live in one mindset and you're looking back at the other and you acknowledge the contrast between the two. So how do we bridge that gap? Because otherwise, it's very hard to read this tradition. So this year, in my Lunch and Learn classes, we've been reading over the great thinkers of the 20th century. So I brought you a selection of them on this question. So today, we're in about a half an hour, we're going to read, Buber, Rosenzweig, Heschel, Kaplan, Schulweis, and Yehuda Amichai. Maybe we'll get through Buber. We'll see. Okay, someone had a question a moment ago. I just wanted to set the scene. Who had a question? Pop had a question.
I was just going to say, Rabbi Hartman was here lecturing here one day.
Yes.
And looking at Schulweis, who was in the audience, he said, in that moment of crisis, when you're terrified, you have the right to believe in a God with a long beard in the sky.
Okay.
And if it doesn't come true, at least from the time you're terrified to the time it happens, it gives you a little bit of hope.
Okay.
It's like taking an aspirin when it hurts.
Yeah, but the question, you're right. So in moments of crisis, I can revert to a theology that in moments of clarity I don't believe in. But when I have to decide how to live my life, do I go by, which myth do I go by? Which truth governs the way I live my life? That's the great question. So let's take a look. The first thinker we're going to take a look at is a man named Martin Buber. You've all heard of him? Born in 1878 in Vienna. His mother abandoned him when he was a little kid. And he moved to Lemberg in Eastern Europe to live with his grandfather. Was raised by his grandfather in a very traditional world. Returns then to Zurich and then Vienna and then Berlin, where he takes a doctorate and becomes an instructor in philosophy and actually the first professor of Jewish studies in the world in Germany and a great leader in the Zionist and Jewish communities of Germany. And then in the 1930s, he's evacuated from Germany by the Zionists to Israel, and he was a professor of Jewish thought at the Hebrew University until his death in 1965. You might want to know that Harold Schulweis wrote the first English language master's thesis on Buber's philosophy. And I have upstairs a very interesting story. Buber was coming to the University of Judaism here in LA to give a summer of lectures. And he was coming through New York in 1952, and Schulweis wired him and said, I'd like to share with you what I wrote. So they meet in a hotel, and Schulweis gives him the master's thesis. And Buber thanks him very much. On his way back, after the end of the summer, beginning of the season in Jerusalem, Buber wires Schulweis and says, let's meet, and hands him a page of corrections and comments. I have that page upstairs, signed by Martin, in written handwriting, in English, in handwriting, and basically said to Schulweis, you know, you gave up on me before you even read me. You didn't believe in me, and Schulweis years later acknowledged that he was right. Acknowledged that he was right. Schulweis acknowledged that Buber's observation, that Schulweis had not really read Buber carefully, that he was already prejudiced against his way of thinking because of his rationalism, we'll get to Schulweis in a minute, was exactly right. And that he reread Buber later in his life and realized what he'd missed the first time. So here's Buber. Buber gives us a wonderful insight into his life in an essay he wrote later in his life, which was autobiographical. It's called A Conversion. He says, in my early years, the religious was for me the exception. Buber, in his early years, was very taken with Buddhism and practiced a form of Buddhist meditation long before it became popular, right? There were hours which were taken out of the course of things. He was meditating, right? From somewhere or other, the firm crust of the everyday was pierced. Then the reliable permanence of appearances broke down. The attack which took place burst this law asunder. Religious experience was the experience of an otherness which did not fit into the context of life. The religious lifted you out. Over there now lay the accustomed existence with its affairs, but here illumination and ecstasy and rapture held, without any time or sequence. So he was practicing a meditation, and there was no relationship between the insights or the experience of his meditation and the real life that he was living, right? The illegitimacy of such a division of the temporal life was brought home to me by an everyday event, an event of judgment. What happened was no more than one afternoon, after a morning of religious enthusiasm, I had a visit from an unknown young man without being there in spirit. So the professor's sitting in his office, meditating all morning. And he has office hours that begin at noon. And he finishes the meditation, there's a knock at the door, and he's roused out of the meditation, right? So he rolls up the rug, blows out the incense, puts away the bell, right? Sits up in the chair, and a kid comes in to see him in the university, but his head isn't there. His head is still in the meditation. What?
I said he put out the joint.
No. He wasn't into drugs. It was meditation. He says, without being there, I certainly did not fail to let the meeting be friendly. I did not treat him any more remissly than all of his contemporaries who were in the habit of seeking me out this time of day as an oracle that is ready to listen to reason. He was a very, very popular leader of young people, particularly college students in the Berlin area, because here was a guy who knew tradition and was a wise man. He's a little older. He's in his late 20s, early 30s. But he, so people came to him for advice. He says, I treated the kid politely. I answered his questions, right? I conversed attentively and openly with him. Only I omitted to guess the question which he did not put. So he answered the questions that were asked of him, but he didn't answer the questions that the kid didn't ask. He didn't guess what the question was. Later, not long after, I learned from one of his friends, he himself was no longer alive, the essential content of these questions. Now, many people thought for many years that the kid was contemplating suicide. That's not what happened. Buber's teaching assistant at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem was Rivka Horowitz, and Rivka Horowitz was my professor of Jewish thought. Rivka Horowitz looked up his diaries and said that wasn't the issue. The issue was this. The kid was an only child. This was the First World War. The kid wanted to enlist in the German army to go fight for the Kaiser because he was a passionate nationalist. But his mother said, stay home with me. And the kid didn't know who he owed the bigger allegiance to, his mother or his nation. And he'd come to Buber to ask him that question. But he couldn't quite articulate it. And the professor, because he was still drowsy from his meditation, didn't quite get that was the question being asked. And so he answered the kid's questions, the ones he asked him, but he didn't get to the heart of the matter. He didn't really listen to the kid. That's the issue. And then the kid went off to war, and he died. And he died. And then Buber was shaken awake by this experience, right? So what happens? Buber was a pacifist, by the way, and objected to the First World War and would have told him not to enlist. That's what he meant, okay? I learned that he had come to me not casually, but born by destiny, not for a chat, but for a decision. He had come to me, he had come in this hour, at this moment. What do we expect when we're in despair and yet we go to a man? Surely a presence, by means of which we are told that nevertheless there is meaning. Any one of us, rabbis, counselors, many people come to me all the time and ask for help. And sometimes I can tell them what to do. I'm a pretty pushy counselor. But there's a lot of times when I can't. I can't solve this problem for you. But nevertheless, I mean, I've had this experience where I said to people, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for you. I said, it's okay, I didn't come for an answer. Sometimes you go to somebody, not because you want, what should I do next, but what you want is somebody just to listen. Somebody just to be present. And the opposite is also true. You go to you're talking to somebody and you realize that they're not hearing a word you say. They're elsewhere. You ever been at a cocktail party and someone's looking over your shoulder to see if there's anybody more interesting there to talk to than you? You ever have that experience? They're sort of surveying and deciding, I stay with this person. He's a better looking person over there. I mean, so Buber says, I'm talking to this. I realized that when I was talking to the kid, I wasn't there. And that's what he wanted. He didn't want me to tell him what to do. He just wanted me to be present, to remind him that he matters. I want someone there to remind me that I matter. And I come at this moment in this way, right? So what happens? He has this isn't just a casual experience. This shakes up Buber completely, changes his whole way of thinking about religion. Since then, I have given up the religious, meaning, religious experiences would take you out of the world, which is nothing but the exception, extraction, exaltation, ecstasy. You hear all the X's in that word? Meaning they take me out of the world, or it's given me up. I possess nothing but the everyday out of which I'm never taken. The mystery is no longer disclosed. It has escaped. It has made its dwelling here in the fullness of each mortal's hour, fullness of claim and responsibility. Though far from equal to it, yet I know that in the claim I am claimed and may respond in responsibility. I know who speaks and demands a response. I do not know much more. If that is religion, then it's just everything simply in all that is lived in its possibility of dialogue. If you think that in order to reach God, you have to leave normal life, the normal encounters we have with people, the normal everyday relationships that we engage in, Buber says you are sorely mistaken. Every moment of life places a claim on us, and our response, our responsibility is what comes back. Claim and responsibility. That's called dialogue. Every person who speaks to you is asking you for something. They're asking you for presence, to be there fully, to acknowledge the humanity of the other. That, for him, is religion. So this initiates what he calls the life of dialogue. And this is where he finds God. But notice what this is about. There's no content to this. Like, at the end of the conversation, like, what did he tell you? He didn't tell me anything. Well, why was it important to you? Because he was present. When you have a conversation, it's the presence. It's being there. It's acknowledging the other. It's responding. But it's not content. This is going to set up a paradigm, a model for what revelation is. Like the Rizhiner Rebbe, for Buber, revelation doesn't have content. God does not come down and give you a whole list of laws. God simply shows up. And in showing up, that's all you need to know. Because if God shows up, then you matter. If God shows up, that's all. That changes the whole way you understand the universe. In the same way that if another human being shows up. I don't know how many of you have ever had to sit Shiva. His mama's yard site this last week. So I said, I came to you. If you ever had to sit Shiva, it's the weirdest thing. People think they have to make conversation. How about them Dodgers? And you say, like, shut up. I don't want to talk about the Dodgers. I don't even want to talk about my mom. Just be here. Just show up. That's all you need to. You showed up. That was all the testimony I needed to comfort me when I'm feeling bereaved. So there's no content to this. And because every relationship is unique in its own, because it's the presence, it's my presence, you can't dictate what this is about. Dictating a set of rules or laws, that may be my response. When the relationship is over, I may decide to hold on to it by keeping certain charms, rituals, or other facts, but there's no content to it. So here is Buber on God. In every sphere in its own way, through each process of becoming that is present to us, we look out to the fringe of the eternal you. Now, he is terribly obscure, and the fact that he's being translated from obscure German into even more obscure English makes it harder, right? Buber, by the way, knew he was being obscure, because he gives a set of lectures, and I have the notes of the lectures, because Professor Horowitz collected them. And he says in this, he says, look, I'm sorry I'm obscure. I write like a philosopher. What do you want out of my life? He says, but you know this. You know that there are certain relationships that you have in the world which make your life worth living. Those are called I-thou relationships. And the content, there's no content to those relationships. It's simply the presence of a human being who is earnestly willing to be present to you. And that's what he says. So he says, in every one of those relationships, which he calls I-thou or I-you, that's when you glimpse God. God is present in that relationship. Because God is the eternal you. Buber really believes in God. He believes that God is real, not just an experience. God is real. But here's the thing. You can only apprehend God as a you, not as an it. The moment you start talking about God, you've turned God into an it. In the same way that if I talk about Mort, I've turned Mort into an image, into an idea. When I talk to Mort, it's very different. So somebody once asked Buber, he was asked on German television, do you believe in God? And he said, no. And the interviewer was aghast, because the guy's like a famous theologian, right? He said, well, how do you mean you don't believe in God? He said, I don't believe in God, I know God. Which is the difference between, do you believe in Gelman? No.
Even I don't believe it.
Even Gelman doesn't believe in Gelman.
And I'm Gelman.
But that's what God said, right? Anochi Adonai Elohim, right? But I know him. Why do I? Because we spend time together. Because yes, exactly right.
He saves Gelman.
Right. So you get to when you encounter a person, you know them, and you know them in a form, in a wholeness which can never be reduced to a description. That's why writing a eulogy is so hard. Because when you have a few words to describe a full human being in all of their dimensions, it's absolutely impossible to do. But if you know the person, you know them in all of their presence and all of dimension. So here's what he said. Look at the next paragraph. Extended, the lines of relationship intersect in the eternal you. Every time I engage in an I-you relationship, every time I fully take in the presence and uniqueness of another human being, I also have a sense that God is present in that moment. So it isn't that Israel shows up on Mount Sinai once in history. Mount Sinai is a symbol for every time you show up to another human being in an I-you relationship. That is a revelatory experience. But there's no content to that. Buber was ferociously antinomian, which means he lit a cigar Erev Shabbos. Right? Oh my God. He was so anti-nomian. He not only was not observant of any laws of the Jewish tradition, he made fun of people who did. Uriel Simon was my professor of Bible. Uriel Simon's father was the great educator Ernst Simon. Ernst Simon was Buber's best friend. And Uriel says that every Friday night, just as my mother started to light candles, the phone would ring. Like exactly on the dot. So the guy who called knew when Shabbos began, and it would ring and ring. This was before answering machines were invented. It would ring and ring and ring and ring, and it was always Buber. Because Buber made fun of the fact that Ernst Simon, his best friend, was Shomer Shabbos. And he would make fun of him by calling him Erev Shabbos and making the phone ring 100 times. And Simon says, yeah, we knew it was, we'd all say, Good Shabbos, Professor Buber. Good Shabbos, Professor Buber. Because Buber believed that if you put laws, if you say, see, it's not just that he was he didn't observe, he was antinomian, he was against that. Because once you muck up the relationship with a bunch of rules, you forget that there's a human being on the other side. When you make God a lawgiver, you turn God into an it. You have to be present to the other. I can give you a really bad analogy, and I apologize for this, but I was at Barnes & Noble, Oliver Shalom, and I noticed that next to for some reason, I guess Body and Soul, next to the philosophy section, there was a whole shelf of books on how to make love. I swear to God, right? And I couldn't help but go take a look, because I'm in the business of love, right? So I'm looking at this book, and it's like there's diagrams and recipes and like and I'm just imagining like, oh, no, honey, no, move to no, you moved too far, now go back. Like you're supposed to sit in bed with your lover and the book, and no, you're doing it all wrong, Like if you need a book to tell you how to make love, you're not making love. You're following a recipe. There has to be something spontaneous and present that's missing if I have to tell you how to, if it becomes all technique. This is very well spelled out by Buber. So he becomes an enemy of the Orthodox, an enemy of the religious establishment. I have a friend who was thrown out of a yeshiva in Jerusalem because they found a copy of I Thou under his pillow, He was reading it every night, but like everyone else would go to sleep, and he sits with a flashlight reading Buber, because he was antinomian. Because he said, if you add law to this, you've messed it up. You have to be present. That's the point. The only law is the law of being present to the other, to fully apprehend the uniqueness of the human being who sits in front of you, as he talks about in the encounter he had with this young man. That's the only halacha. So at the bottom here, this is an essay. This is from a speech he gave. In 1919, he was commissioned by a youth group, a Zionist youth group in Prague, to come and give a series of lectures on Judaism. Now, this is not a lightweight group of people. Franz Kafka and Max Brod were part of this youth group, right? Shmuel Hugo Bergman, who was the chairman of the philosophy department at Hebrew University, was part of this youth group. So this really, 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 really smart group of kids. So Buber goes, and the lectures are collected in a beautiful book called On Judaism. So this is one of them. So he says, the question, he says, everyone's worried. This is 1919, by the way, Central Europe. Everyone's worried about why kids aren't holding on to Judaism. In case that sounds familiar. We're not, he says, the problem is this. You're stating the problem all wrong. He says, it's not that kids are abandoning religion. It's kids are abandoning your idea of religion. That's what he says. He says, we're not concerned with imposing religion upon youth or forcing it into a system of the knowable and doable, but with awakening youth's own latent religion. That means its willingness to confront unwaveringly the impact of the unconditional. Young people are out there looking for truth. They just don't want your formulations of it, because you become very doctrinaire in telling them what they have to believe, right? We must not preach to youth that God's revelation becomes manifest in only one and no other way. Rather, we must show it that nothing is incapable of becoming a receptacle of revelation. That's what you had before, right? Every moment in the world that you confront a human being is the possible Mount Sinai. It's not once. It happens all the time. It's not a question of whether God comes into the world. It's a question of whether you're ready to really experience the world in that way. This is a classic Hasidic teaching. Kids ask me this all the time. If God spoke to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and all those guys, how come God doesn't speak to anybody today? So I said to the kids, I'll go ask her. I came back and I said, God told me that she won't speak to anybody who watches television. And the kids laughed at me. I said, no, I'm not kidding, because television is the opposite of revelation, right? You have to pay attention. Television's not. I said, here's the real truth, right? God hasn't stopped speaking since the day the world was created. The question is, are you ready to listen? That's the question. Is Shavuot the holiday of the giving of Torah or the giving or the receiving of Torah? There's a big difference. So for the Hasidic tradition, God's been speaking since the day the world was created. What happened on Mount Sinai is that the whole Jewish people showed up and shut up. The only time in all of Jewish history that all of us were quiet enough to hear God talk. Because you got to shut up. You got to quiet the ego. You have to quiet the... You ever talk to somebody and you know they're not hearing you, they're thinking about what they want to say to you next? Right? That's pretty typical, right? So how do you quiet that voice and really listen to what the other person's trying to say? So Buber says, it's a question, every moment has the possibility of revelation. Every moment's Mount Sinai. We must proclaim to youth that God can be served by only, but we must make it clear that every deed is hallowed if it radiates a spirit of unity. We must not ask young people to avow as exclusively binding only that which emanates at some hour of the past. You can see why Jewish leaders didn't like him very much, right? Because he's saying, give them the freedom to discover their own truth. Don't tell them what truth is. If you go down about 3/4 of the way, there's a sentence here I want you to read, right? We who consider life as more divine than laws and rules do not want to regulate the life of youth by laws and rules attributed to God. Try that. We want to help youth not to bypass its destiny, not to miss its metaphysical self-discovery by being asleep and respond to its senses within its power of the unconditional. Right? By doing so, we do not diminish the openness of youth to promote and affirm. It's not about laws and rules, it's about being open. So this is Buber. This is a lot like that idea that all the revelation was just the first letter, the silent letter. So Buber has a chavrusa. He has a partner. His partner is Franz Rosenzweig. Franz Rosenzweig died of ALS at a very, very young age. He was 39 years old. Had he lived, he would have been the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. Rosenzweig writes a letter to Buber saying, you got it all wrong, boy. He says, you reject law because you think law gets in the way of the immediate relationship you have with God. That's because you don't understand law. You just don't understand what it is. And here's what he says. It's a little obscure. It's incredibly obscure. He distinguishes between two ideas, law and commandment. Okay? Law is what's written in the book. Don't eat lobster. Okay? Commandment is when a person takes a law and makes it an expression of their own inner truth. When that law becomes an expression of your own inner truth, it changes from something inert and external and objective to something internal. It becomes my commandment. It's God speaking to me. It's God speaking to me. Right? People ask me, how come you keep Shabbos? You keep Shabbos because God told you? Hell no. Right? I keep Shabbos First of all, because if you don't make Shabbos every week, you're nuts. In this culture, are you crazy? Turn off your cell phone one day a week? Woo. Number two, I don't keep Shabbos because God told me. I keep Shabbos so that I can have some time with God. Shabbos is my mitzvah. It's no longer a voice telling me, Feinstein, turn off the damn cell phone and pay attention to your family. It's the one thing every week I have to do. Otherwise, I don't stay sane. So this is what he means by law and commandment. And he says to Buber, in the same way that you have told us about presence, I find presence in law. Law must become commandment, which seeks to be transformed into deed in the very moment it is heard. It must regain living reality, in which all great Jewish periods have sensed the guarantee for its eternity. Like teaching, it must consciously, I tell you, it's obscure. It must consciously start where content stops being content and becomes inner power. It's my mitzvah. It's my mitzvah. So what Rosenzweig would say is, don't take the whole Torah at once. Start with one mitzvah. Make it your mitzvah. What mitzvah is your mitzvah? What mitzvah speaks to the soul of your being and defines you as a human being? And becomes representative of your inner power. That's, for Rosenzweig, the appropriation of law as commandment. So for Rosenzweig, Sinai is whenever a human being finds a religious act and makes it their own. That's what Mount Sinai represents. What Sinai was, the Torah does have content. He disagrees with Buber. It's a menu of things that you can appropriate to become expressions of your own inner religious life. It's not a law that you'll get arrested if you don't do it. It's a menu. It's an invitation. It's an invitation to encounter eternity in acts that you perform all the time. Your friend is in the hospital, you run to go see them. Nobody had to tell you to run to go see them. And afterwards, if I said to you, you took time out of your schedule to schlep across the valley, taking your life in your hands to park at Tarzana Hospital. Right? By the way, if you die at Tarzana Hospital, it won't be in surgery or chemotherapy, or it'll be in the parking structure. Right? That's the most dangerous building in North America. Right? There's little old ladies in giant Buicks coming over those, Kaiser's worse, by the way. Right? So because they're both under construction right now, so God help you parking at those. But you went. Why did you go? Why did you go? You say, what do you mean, why did I go? I had to go. That's mitzvah. I had to. That's mitzvah. I had to go. Right? My friend Bob plays beautiful music. If I said, Bob, why do you play music? So what do you mean? I had to play music. Sergio plays music. I had to play music. Gelman writes beautiful stories. He had to do it. It wasn't for the money. Although,
For me, it's the money.
Yeah, I know. No, because it's part of you. It's those things we do because we have. That's mitzvah for Rosenzweig. Now, one step closer to tradition, one more step, much closer, is Heschel. Heschel, so by the way, these guys are all connected to each other. So Buber is teaching in the university when Heschel gets there as a graduate student, right? And then Rosenzweig starts a school in Frankfurt called the Lehrhaus. It's an adult education center. When Rosenzweig dies, Buber becomes its head. And when Buber goes to Israel, Heschel becomes its head. These guys had one hell of an HR department, right? So here, Heschel writes a lot about revelation. I just gave you a few sections from the middle part of his book, God in Search of Man. You really have to read the whole essays to get a sense of it, but just to give you a little bit of sense of it. Heschel is much more traditional, and has a much more traditional sense of what this is. Israel's religion originated in the initiative of God rather than the efforts of man. It was not an invention of man, but a creation of God, not a product of civilization, but a realm of its own. Man would have to have known him. Man would not have known him if he had not approached man. God's relation to man precedes man's relation to him. That's Heschel writes in a funny way. He takes things that you think you know and turns them upside down. So his major book is called God in Search of Man. Now, if you were going to write a book about modern religion, you would write a book called Man in Search of God. But that's Heschel. Heschel says you got it backwards. The great revolution of the Bible is to understand that God is looking for us. Here, the idea is that the Bible is not our book about God. It's God's book about us. It's God looking for us. Because what Heschel is trying to do is displace you and me from the center of our universe. I mean, he's actually Copernican in this sense, right? Instead of saying, I am the center of the universe and I have to go find God out there someplace, he says, no, you're not. Get out of the middle. God's in the middle. You're not in the middle anymore, right? The Bible is all about God's search for man. The mystic experience is man's turning toward God. The prophetic act is God's turning toward man. The former is, first of all, an event in the life of man, contingent on the aspiration issue of man. The latter, that's prophecy, is an event in the life of God, contingent on the pathos and initiative of God. From the mystic experience, we may gain insight of man into God. From the prophetic act, we learn of an insight of God into the life of man. Therefore, to characterize revelation, that's God talking to us, as prophetic insight or experience is to reduce a reality to a perception. So here's what he says. He says, look, stop for a moment, stop imposing your skepticism on the Bible and read what it says. This is a kind of thinking called, here's a great word to drop in conversation later in the day, phenomenology. Here's what phenomenology is, right? Take what the book says, and ask yourself, what is it saying? I mean, before you say, this is wrong, what is it saying? And what world is this drawing for me? What picture of the world is this drawing for me, right? You bracket out all of the skepticism. And you ask yourself, if this is a truth, what truth is it telling me? So the truth of the Bible, says Heschel, is that there's a God in the world, and that God is reaching through that world, even though that God is infinite and ultimately other, reaching through that world to reach you because you matter that much to God. And what's really interesting is you can read through the rest of this text. What's really interesting is that the stuff that matters to God is not the stuff you think. It's not some eternal truth. The stuff that matters to God is that there are widows and orphans living on the streets of your city and you don't see them. The stuff that matters to God is the everyday injustices and evil. We talked about this last week. The stuff that matters are the details, the nitty-gritty of metropolitan urban life that you've lost track of. That's the stuff that matters to God. And look at the bottom paragraph for just a moment, right? The degree of our appreciation of the Bible is determined by the degree of our sensitivity to the, listen to these words, to the divine dignity of human deeds. The insight into the divine implication of human life is the distinct message of the Bible. The Bible shattered man's illusion of being alone. Sinai broke the cosmic silence that thickens our blood with despair. God does not stand aloof from our cries. He is not only a pattern, but a power, and life is a response, not a soliloquy. The Bible shows the way of God with man and the way of man with God. It contains both the complaint of God against the wicked and the shriek of the smitten man demanding justice. And there dwells also in its pages reminders of man's incredible callousness and obstinacy, of his immense capacity to bring about his doom, as well as the assurance that beyond all evil is the compassion of God. So Buber's going to say this. Look, I know you're skeptical. I know that your modernity has put you in a place where it's very hard to read any of this and take it seriously. But for a moment, bracket that out and read what it says and ask yourself if there isn't at least a moral message there that makes some sense, that gives you a different way of apprehending your reality. A different way of apprehending your reality. For Buber, religion is a way of truth. And the only way to really apprehend it is to live in it for a little while, to see the world through the eyes of the prophets. Yes?
Any of these guys write any of this stuff after the Holocaust?
Yeah, all of it's written after the Holocaust. I mean, some of the Buber stuff is before, but Heschel's after the Holocaust. Heschel lost his whole family in the Holocaust. Right? This is exactly what he's saying. The prophet for him it was his way of processing the experience of the Holocaust. Because after this, he becomes a big political activist. Right? He writes an essay about the Vietnam War. Right? The essay about his essay is actually was a speech he gave at Riverside Church. He said, imagine you woke up one morning and discovered that the whole world had gone nuts and that you were part of it. It's a really interesting political essay. And right? Because this is the prophet becomes his way of understanding. All right, so what do we have here in these three thinkers? We have three thinkers who are going to say, I want to try to bridge a gap between you and traditional religion by understanding how it is that a modern person can apprehend this notion that God speaks to us. And the way I want to do that is by changing the way you think. So for Buber, he's going to say, you know all about relationships. Imagine that as a paradigm, as a model for how we approach God. For Rosenzweig, you know about those inner compulsive acts, things you have to do. That's how you understand mitzvah. And for Heschel, you know about your own sense of moral outrage at the world. That's what the prophets were trying to say. Now, let's take a different tack. A set of other thinkers. These are American thinkers now. They come at this from exactly the opposite direction. They come at this from the opposite direction. Instead of trying to change your mind so you can understand the tradition's idea of revelation, they're going to say, let's change the tradition's idea of revelation to fit the way we think. And the person who got this most powerfully was a teacher named Mordecai Kaplan. There is a story about Mordecai Kaplan which I think is apocryphal, but it's still good. It may not be true, but it's still right. Kaplan was ordained Orthodox, became an Orthodox rabbi. He's 23 years old, giving a sermon on Passover in an Orthodox shul, the Jewish Center in New York. And he's talking about the miracles of Pesach. The sea splitting, the frogs, the lice, you know all the miracles of Pesach, right? And in the middle of the sermon, he stops. Just smack in the middle of it. He just stops cold. And stand there in silence for about 4 minutes. And then the congregation is like, what's wrong with the rabbi? What's wrong with the rabbi? And the cantor goes over and says, you okay? And he says, so that he goes, without a word, he sits down, and the cantor completes the sermon, the service. And later, Kaplan said, here's what happened. I'm in the middle of this sermon about the miracles of Pesach. And I asked myself a question which no rabbi should ever ask himself while he's giving a sermon. Do you believe in any of this stuff? Do you really believe what you just said? Kaplan has a degree. Kaplan has a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Columbia University. He's working on a PhD with John Dewey. He's living in a scientific society. And he's talking about seas that split, frogs that come from heaven, sticks that turn into snakes, bushes that burn, God's voice. And he stops and says, what are you saying? What are you saying? You can't believe in any. And so he resigns, by the way. He resigned from the pulpit right after Yontif. Yeah. And he gave up the rabbinate. And he became a salesman for the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company of New York. Here's the problem. If you can't sell Torah, you can't sell life insurance. I mean, if you can't lie to Jews about one thing, you can't, I mean, you know. So he was like the worst salesman of insurance there ever was. And Solomon Schechter, who was the president of the seminary, invites him to become a teacher at the seminary, and he spent the rest of his life as a professor. Kaplan says simply, Kaplan, well, this is true. Kaplan would interrupt a prayer. The kids at JTS would be singing Birkat HaMazon. And the last line of Birkat HaMazon is, Na ra'iti v'gam zakanti v'lo ra'iti tzadik ne'ezav. I was young and I'm old and I've never seen a righteous man go hungry. Kaplan would slam his fist on the table, scream at the top of his lungs, do you believe that? Do you believe that? Then why do you say it? Kaplan wanted consistency. So Kaplan says, look, knowing what I know about the world scientifically, knowing what I know about religious the history of it, I want a religion I can believe in. Stop giving me bavamaises. And what's the single principle of all of science? Benji's here, so I can ask him this, right? Welcome home. This Mazel Tov on your graduate. The single, no, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to pick on the poor kid, you know. The single principle of all of science is that the laws of the universe apply in all places at all times. This is by the way, pre-Einsteinian physics. It's Newtonian physics, but that when we talk about religion, we talk about natural and supernatural. God lives in that realm of the supernatural, and sometimes the law of the supernatural impinges on the natural. We call that miracles, right? But the fact is that doesn't occur. Science tells you there's laws of science, and they occur in all places and all time under all circumstances. Frankly, you wouldn't want to live in a world where gravity worked only 99 times out of 100. Just think of that for a minute, right? It just doesn't happen. If something happens and it's uncanny and we say, ooh, miracle, there's some natural explanation for it. That's what we assume. So Kaplan says, okay, within the bounds of nature, within the bounds of the natural, within the bounds of the reasonable, within the bounds of common sense, what can I believe in? So this is what he writes. This is his idea of God in one paragraph. Well, I appreciate a God that can put his whole theology in one paragraph. I assume that man, that's human beings, once his physiological needs are satisfied, begins to experience the need to overcome such traits as self-indulgence, arrogance, envy, exploitation, and hatred, or to bring under control the aggressive forces of his nature. Right? Once you're materially surviving, then you try to become the person you're meant to be. You evolve. This constitutes man's true destiny as a species, right? Therein lies his salvation. This is a religious word. From that point, it is natural to arrive at the next step, which requires no blind leap into the dark. The next step is to conclude that the cosmos is so constituted as to enable man to fulfill his highest human need. Okay? The world is built, and there are enough resources for us to become the people God means us to be. We're meant to be, right? A magnetic needle hung on a thread or placed on a pivot assumes of its own accord a position in which one end of the needle points north and the other south. So long as it is free to move about, all attempts to deflect it will not get it to remain away from its normal direction. Likewise, man normally veers in the direction of that which makes for his fulfillment of his destiny as a human being, which is the perfection of himself. That fact indicates the functioning of a cosmic power, capital P, which influences his behavior. What magnetism is to the magnetic needle, godhood or God is to man. So the fact that human beings try to be good, that we try to be good, even criminals, even people who are criminal, even people who are sociopaths, will pretend that they're doing the right thing. There's something in us which makes us want to try to be good. That, says Kaplan, is God. Now, he did write that before the war. That's God. That's the godhood of the cosmos. There is nobody up there. There's no old guy with a beard. There's no cosmic woo-woo spirit, because none of that means anything, right? The fact that human beings seek the right, seek the good. To carry the analogy one step further, just as a magnetic needle is the source of our knowledge of the Earth's magnetism, so is man's salvational behavior the source of our knowledge of God. Right? Why do people do altruistic acts? What draws them to be altruistic, to be self-sacrificing, to be moral heroes? That's the godhood of the world. And just as we learn from the action of the magnetic needle the laws of magnetism, so do we learn from man's salvational behavior, which we come progressively really understand, the law or will of God. When you see what moral heroes are all about, that's what revelation is. It's what you learn about the moral life from people who do moral things. The fact that the cosmos possesses the resources and man the abilities, which themselves are part of those resources, to enable him to fulfill his destiny as a human being or achieve salvation, is the godhood of the cosmos. Get it? So what is God for Kaplan? God is that which draws us to do the right. It's in us and around us. Number one, it's what draws us to do the right thing. And number two, it's the faith that the world is constituted in such a way that if we really wanted to make peace and hope and right, turn this into a paradise, we could do it. There's enough food on the planet to feed us all. There's enough water to quench us all. There's enough resources to quench us all. We could do this if we put our minds to it. That's Kaplan's faith. So what is revelation? What happened at Mount Sinai? Mount Sinai then becomes the symbol for whenever human beings come to that realization that this is what I'm meant to do. This is any moment you follow the laws of conscience. So Kaplan is a writer with a great idea, one great idea. He has a couple of students who are really much brighter than him. One of them, is Harold Kushner, and the other is Harold Schulweis. So here's Schulweis, who is Kaplan's student. This is his Rashi on Kaplan, as it were, right? Two statements from Schulweis, one early, one late. The first one's 1956, and the second one's 1994. The Torah is the selective record of Israel's extraordinary religious interpretation of its collective experience during the formative period of its career. I said, Harold, don't write like that. Come on, man, give me a break. So what is the Torah? We look back at our experience and we tell our story and we say we learned something. Freedom is the way human beings need freedom. Slavery is not the way, right? The origin of Torah lies not in an extra mundane source, which has cast down absolute truths upon a receiving people, right? There's no God in heaven screaming down, Andy Hyman, stop eating lobster. That's not where Torah comes from. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Right? Nor is it the arbitrary projection of human inventiveness flung upward, nor is it simply whatever we've decided to do, nor is it whatever we decided to do. It's not arbitrary. What is it? I just kidding. You can have all the left. I'll give you a ticket. I have this idea that we should all get like 3 TRAFE tickets a year. Don't you think? All right. Torah is rooted, listen carefully, this is Schulweis at his worst. Torah is rooted in the matrix of a living organism in a people, which discovers out of its existence with failure and fortune the power of godliness residing within it and its total environment. So you have a people, and a people over time discovers the way to live a life that's worth living. And they record that in a book, and that's called Torah. It's out of a people's experience. It's not arbitrary because it's out of our own experience, right? Torah as revelation is the product of Israel's creative transaction with history. So that it's a completely naturalistic idea. There's no God up there. There's simply us trying to figure out how to live a life that matters. And that's what Torah is. And that's what Torah is, because that's as much truth as you're going to find in the world. Now, later in his life, Rabbi Schulweis comes to a different idea, slightly different idea. He fastens on the idea of conscience. And he asks the question, why don't we religious people talk about conscience more often? What is conscience? Think about conscience, right? So he comes to this idea of conscience, right? Conscience is the inner witness to the covenant that carries divine and human signatories. So here, what is he going to say? It's not a God up there shouting instructions down at poor Andy, nor is it just whatever we Jews felt like believing in, right? You develop a sense of right and wrong that's internal, and you cultivate that through the centuries of tradition. That's what tradition is about, cultivating a sense of right and wrong. The status and role of conscience in religion casts a different complexion on revelation. Revelation is not a one-way directive from above or a human projection from below. Same ideas he had before. Revelation is the dialogue of reciprocal covenant, an ongoing process of listening, interpreting, receiving, and giving. Awareness of having entered the covenant makes it impossible to separate the divine and human element in the encounter of revelation. Conscience is the hyphen of the human-divine covenant that runs both ways. So we have a conversation with God about how we should live our lives. But it's not God shouting instructions. We're part of the conversation. We're part of the conversation. And conscience is that part of the conversation. Conscience is where you feel the presence of God within you. Right? Conscience is the hyphen in the human-divine covenant that runs both ways. Conscience and commandment are not rivals, but co-respondents to the moral covenant. Now, one more piece about this. So Douglas asked a very important question. Did any of these guys write after the war? After the Holocaust, which makes everything much harder to understand. And Schulweis faces the same issue, right? But here, he's interested in the following kind of question. Can I say that there is conscience even there? If there's some sector, some moment in human experience where conscience is dead, then it's very hard to think of conscience as the presence of God in the world. So in 1963, Schulweis meets a man who saved 5,500 Jews in Germany. He was a member of the Nazi Party who had a construction company. His name was Fritz Graebe. And in 1963, he was working as the maintenance supervisor of the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco. But during the war, he saved 5,500 Jews on the Ukrainian border by putting them on construction crews and keeping them away from the Nazis. And when the Nazis found out what he did, they were going to arrest him, and he crossed the lines, testified at Nuremberg, which made him an outlaw, and came to San Francisco, right, and got a job at the Fairmont Hotel, right? Benjamin Swig was the owner of the Fairmont Hotel who gave him a job. And Schulweis said, what did we ever do to say thank you to you? And he said, I don't want your thanks. I did this because it was the right thing to do. And Schulweis is so taken with this idea. Here is a German, a real German, I mean a member of the party German, and he said, why'd you do this? He said, what do you mean, why'd I do this? Well, they were killing people. What do you mean, why'd I do this? Right? And that begins his search for Christian rescuers. Now, the search for Christian rescuers is attached to his theology. Because if you believe that conscience is the evidence that God hasn't abandoned the world, you have to show me that there's even conscience in the Holocaust. You don't have to show me that everybody had conscience, but you have to show me something of conscience. And if I can show you 1,500 Christians who risked their lives to save Jews, you know the famous ones of Schindler and Sugihara, but there are many others, then I know that God is alive even in Auschwitz, you see? And that's Schulweis's answer. That's why Schulweis answers the Holocaust in that way. Because he's trying to prove that human moral response is in fact the presence of God in the world. So now we've come all the way, okay, from Buber's maximal antinomianism to Rosenzweig's understanding of law as personal, to Heschel recommitting to the biblical idea of revelation. Kaplan reconceives of God in this very naturalistic way, and Schulweis offers us a Torah, which is the product of a people's experience, and then this idea of conscience. Conscience as revelation. Each of them reads the Shavuot story just slightly differently. All right, before we conclude, any questions, comments, counter sermons? So I brought you one gentle piece to end with, because we have to have one gentle piece. Yeah, Michael.
Yeah,
Pass the mic. Yes.
you were talking about Rosenzweig earlier.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that Rosenzweig, as you said, had he lived, would have become one of the great philosophers
Yeah.
of the 20th century. He died early, and therefore he became sort of a transitional figure. But I think the important thing about Rosenzweig was where Buber was a pacifist, Rosenzweig internally was a pacifist, but ended up serving in the army,
Yeah.
the German army during World War I.
Right.
I don't know if he was a machine gunner or a spotter.
No, he was a spotter, anti-aircraft battery.
He was an anti-aircraft spotter, or an aircraft spotter.
Yeah.
He was situated, I think, on a hill somewhere in Bavaria. And every day he wrote a postcard to his mother, and those postcards eventually became his great book, The Star of Redemption.
Right.
Which I think is an amazing piece. And he does, in The Star, he talks about the three pilgrimage holidays of Pesach, Sukkot, and Shavuot.
Right.
And explains each one of them from his own perspective. And I think because he had seen war and he had known peace and had gone through this period, that's what made him this great transitional period between Buber
Yeah.
and then moving forward to Kaplan and Heschel and Rabbi Schulweis.
Yeah, Heschel, not Kaplan, but Heschel, certainly. He's a transitional figure because he opens up a doorway to accept mitzvah, right? What is mitzvah to him? How do I apprehend an idea that God commands me to do something? And this idea that the command, that the law, the ritual itself may be written in a book, but the commandment is my own inner commandment. right? It's my own inner. If I give my wife roses on our anniversary because I'm supposed to give my wife roses on the anniversary, it means one thing. If I give my wife roses on my anniversary because I really love her and I'm glad she stayed with me all these years, and I'm sort of amazed by that, it means a very different thing. That's what Rosenzweig is trying to say. The inner drive becomes, that's mitzvah. So it's a bridge to a traditional life. It became very popular in the Reform movement because it's a bridge out of that complete moral autonomy to a notion of mitzvah in the Reform movement. Let's finish with this. We've dealt with some very heavy philosophers today. I want you to go home and memorize this. No, this will all be on the test. Yehuda Amichai was the great poet laureate of Israel. Lived in Jerusalem, born in 1933, died in 2003, 4, 6? Anyway, recently. Lived in Yamin Moshe, very gentle man, and wrote beautiful poetry, which is very accessible, very, very accessible poetry. And he writes a poem about Revelation, which is very, very gentle. So listen to that. Having done all the stuff we just done, listen to this one. My father was God and didn't know it. That's true, by the way. He gave me the 10 Commandments, neither in thunder nor in fury, neither in fire nor in cloud, but rather with gentleness and love. He added caresses and kind words. He added, I beg you, please. And he sang, keep Shamor and remember Zachor in a single melody, and he pleaded and he cried quietly between one utterance and the next. Do not take the name of God in vain. Do not take it, not in vain. I beg you, do not bear false witness against your neighbor. And he hugged me tightly and whispered in my ear, do not steal, do not commit adultery, do not murder. And he put his palms of his open hands on my head with the Yom Kippur blessing. Honor, love, in order that your days might be long on earth. And my father's voice was white like the hair on his head. Later on, he turned his face to me one last time, like on the day when he died in my arms, and said, I want to add 2 to the 10 Commandments. The 11th commandment, thou shalt not change. And the 12th commandment, thou must surely change. So said my father, then turned from me and walked off, disappearing into his strange distance. I don't know. I don't know. It's a whole, first of all, we can spend a lot of time, but I want you to sit with this. We always imagine God to have the face of the parents who raised us. We always imagine God to have the face of the parents. It's inevitable because when we were very small, they were God. And the question is, when you imagine the moment of revelation at Mount Sinai, do you imagine a God who's shouting down from the heavens? Or do you imagine a God who, with parental love, puts his hands on your head and says, please, please, I beg you, please. It's such a beautiful sense of a gentleness. And maybe what he's saying is that at this moment in our history, having gone through what we went through, a gentle God who pleads with us instead of a harsh God who commands us is more what we need. So sit with us a few minutes. We'll see each other next Shabbos. Take good care. Tonight, 7:30, Tikkun Leil Shavuos. Tomorrow, the dedication of the building. Monday, we welcome those who have accepted Torah. Come join us. Shabbat Shalom. I got to run. Thank you. Good Shabbos. Yeah, hi.
Rabbi, my father, Rabbi Silver.